Have you ever wondered how big the sports card hobby actually is? Well, in this video, I tried to find statistics and indicators that could give us some insights into this question. Let's get into this. When sports cards first became a thing back in the late 1800s, it was not a big industry. Even the iconic vintage sets we think of now, like the T206 set, the 1933 Gaudi set, or the 1952 Top set, at the time of their releases, the sports card industry was really a pretty small industry. There were collectors, sure, but it was just an inexpensive pastime. But all that started to change when people started to see those dollar signs in their eyes. By 2019, the sports card industry was estimated to be worth $13 billion. And despite the market dips of the last year, the sports card industry itself is still an extremely financially strong industry. Let's look at some different stats and information and reflect on what they may mean. Number one, there have been nearly 1 billion cards produced throughout history, and that number will just keep increasing. On any given day, there could be upwards of 40 million cards listed up for sale on eBay alone. That's quite a high supply, and a supply number that is ever increasing. Number two, in the heyday of the junk wax era in the early 1990s, there were estimated to be more than 4 million card collectors. Nowadays, that number is estimated to be less than 1 million, though it does seem likely fanatics will be making a lot of effort to increase that number. So a constantly increasing supply of cards, but less collectors, meaning for the most part less demand, in many ways that's not a healthy combination for those coming at the hobby from a long-term investment angle. But at the same time, those super sought iconic cards still do have a low supply, and sometimes a lower supply over time as they end up getting held by long-term collectors or lost or something like this. So there's plenty of possibilities for gain, but being picky and doing your research is essential. Number three, interestingly, when sports cards began as a thing, since it was mostly in tobacco products, it was almost exclusively an adult's hobby. During the junk wax era, it became mostly a kid's hobby, and nowadays it is back to mostly being an adult's hobby once again. Recently, this has more to do with the high entry cost more than anything else, plus the younger generation is being raised in an era where there are different interests competing for their attention during childhood. Junk wax era kids didn't have many devices, video games and such to distract them in their early childhood days. Plus, watching live sports as part of childhood has also become less common than it used to be, especially because it's become more expensive to go watch a baseball game or something. Many of today's adult collectors are those who started their journey during those kid-oriented junk wax era days. What this means for the future demographic of collectors is an interesting question to ponder. Less kids in the hobby now very likely could mean less adults in the hobby later. But again, who knows what the future holds? There are some indicators that there's efforts being made to make the hobby more accessible to children. Number four, it is impossible to know what the future holds for the sports card industry. Economic investments do estimate that the industry will have a value of over $28 billion by 2028. And remember, I mentioned earlier that in 2019, it was estimated to have a value of $13 billion. But as far as I can tell, these estimates are being made with limited knowledge about the nature of the card industry and what causes it to change. So who knows how accurate or inaccurate these estimates might be. In fact, some estimates during the middle of the pandemic sports card boom estimated that the sports card industry would be worth nearly $100 billion by 2027. These estimates have been lowered significantly since then, but most economic estimates still guess that the industry will gain in value quite significantly over the next 5, 6, 7 years. I don't think these estimates necessarily mean much though, since it's more based on if current trends stay consistent, but as we know, the sports card market is volatile and inconsistent, and it's really hard to know what the future may hold. But saying that, these economic estimates might mean that investors overall are still looking at the industry as a whole with optimistic eyes. But this doesn't necessarily mean much to the individual collector, as the card value of cards on the secondhand market, even if they somehow all had a pretty consistent downward trajectory, doesn't straight up mean the card companies would be making any less money. Even if individual collectors were losing money on their own cards, the industry as a whole could be gaining money. To me, this kind of speaks to the idea that perhaps the best money in the industry is going to be made not by the miners looking for the gold in them hills, aka the card collectors and investors, investors, but more so by those individuals and companies that are providing the mining supplies and venues for miners, aka the businesses that help card collectors and investors in their quests for that gold. Number 5. According to statistics, it seems like American football currently has the largest market share of the sports card market compared to other sports, though I couldn't really figure out the specific numbers about that, or about by how much or anything like that. If nothing else though, I think this highlights how to date, the US market is still the main place for the sports card market, since American football doesn't have a vibrant card market outside of North America. That being said, other statistics also point to the idea that the sports card industry is on a healthy rise in a number of markets outside of the US. eBay reported that on its platform, the percentage of growth in the sports card industry internationally between 2020 and 2021 increased by 162%, and in particular, the markets in Australia, China, Canada, and Europe were all on significant upswings. It also stated that the largest increase in demand as far as sports cards were concerned by far was soccer cards, with a 1,586% increase in sales between 2020 and 2021, which also speaks to the perhaps growing international direction of the sports card market. As a side note here, interestingly, eBay also reported that its single most popular category of trading cards was a non-sports card, Pokemon cards, which they report to see a 500% increase in sales between 2019 and 2020. Now, the 5 points I've talked about in this video are bigger, overarching market trends kinds of things. I don't think any of this speaks to the value increase or decrease possibilities of any specific individual card, but just more about the market as a whole, which probably speaks more to how successful the big companies are going to be rather than us individual collectors. That being said, I do think this is useful information even for an individual collector, since knowledge is power, and understanding how the industry as a whole moves does help to provide some insights into where things are at and where things may be going into the future. What do you think all of this might mean for us individual sports card hobbyists? Let us know in the comments below. Peace.